to.
I'm not very technological, so, oh God, where is it going?
Just shout if you need some help.
Has it come?
Not yet, but it usually takes a few seconds.
No. So, sorry for this. I'm not very technological. I was born before the technology came about. So, as an ancient person, you can understand. Also, the other point is, I have a cold, something that happens every time this period of the year. So you will bear with me. And lastly, when I was invited to participate here, I wasn't given any a specific agenda which suits me very well. And so I decided I was going to come up with this rather funny title of doing translanguaging unknowingly and differently, by which I really want to go to overview my work and relate it to translanguaging, and say really that it looks like I've been doing the same thing as translanguaging theory, but doing it differently. And obviously, if you do it differently, you come to different results. So yeah, I'll talk about my work and relate to translanguaging, taking, of course, translanguaging as the most sort of popular concept currently in use in the study of bilingual language practices. And we will have three steps. I'll just flash some words about translanguaging, and pick up a few which are relevant for the talk. Then I will go over my work, again, picking up what I consider to be relevant. And at the end, we will look at some data to show exactly how what I do relates or doesn't relate or differs from translanguaging. Now, the notion of translanguaging, I don't have to go over its history, comes from Welsh bilingualism or bilingual education. And the term itself really was proposed by Colin Baker. But it's been popularized through the work of Garcia, who basically took it from the local context of Wales and internalized it. And from there, it's gone kind of viral, to use the current terminology. And you have leeway saying that it is used in all kinds of disciplines. And I've highlighted everyday social interaction as what we are going to be concerned with today. And translanguaging came about, at least as far as I can see, in the context of what I may term languaging turn in language studies. Previous to this, people thought of language practices in terms of languages, in terms of separate languages, in terms of named languages. And then came a time when people were not really happy with this. And you have people like Jensen saying the idea of language, of a language, is not suited as an analytical level of for describing language practices. You have Ortega and Garcia saying, and others, saying that no one really speaks a named language. They say a named language is not something that a person speaks. Speakers do not use languages, they use linguistic features. And speakers are languages, and what they do is languaging. And so all this context, all this dissatisfaction with the notion of language gave birth to that of languaging and of translanguaging. And the trans bit itself has many understandings, which I will not go into. But the only thing I will be concerned with is trans as trans language from one language to the other, or involving languages. Now, at least in applied linguistics, there are two understandings to translanguaging. One is translanguaging as pedagogy, dealing with language, how people learn, teach languages, and classroom practices. But you also have translanguaging as a theory of multilingualism, and that's what I'm going to be interested in today. And we have Garcia saying translanguaging is a theoretical lens that offers a different view of bilingualism and multilingualism. And the theory posits that rather than possessing two or more autonomous language systems, so bilinguals, multilinguals, indeed, all users of language select and deploy particular features from a unitary linguistic repertoire to make meaning and to negotiate particular communicative contexts. So yeah, so that kind of saying, translanguaging is a theoretical framework. It's a theoretical perspective on bilingualism and multilingualism, and that's why again I am interested in, at least for today. If we sort of detail that theory, it is based on a view of language. We've seen that people are not happy, have not been happy with the notion of language. And they prefer that of linguistic features. And again, you have George Jensen saying that the idea of separate languages as boundary systems of specific linguistic features belonging together and excluding other linguistic features is found to be insufficient to capture the reality of language use. And they go on to add, we suggest that the level of linguistic features and not the level of language is better suited for the analysis of languaging in super diverse societies, if not everywhere. So the preference for linguistic features rather than language with or without a name. It also has a view of the bilingual's linguistic repertoire as a unitary repertoire. And you have the guy again saying, in adopting the notion of translanguaging, we espouse what we call a unitary view, arguing that bilingualism and multilingualism, despite their importance as sociocultural concepts, have no correspondence in a dual or multiple linguistic system. So again, the myriad linguistic features, so linguistic features mastered by bilinguals, occupy a single differentiated cognitive terrain that is not fenced off into anything like the two areas suggested by the two social named languages. So a unitary system of linguistic features, not necessarily of languages. And they're also based on a view of language use. And that's really the definition of translanguaging at the end of the day. Author Guy and Garcia and Reed say translanguaging refers to the act of deploying all of the speaker's lexical and structural resources freely. And that is highlighted in the original. So of using one's linguistic repertoire without regard for socially and politically defined language labels or boundaries. So and indeed, Garcia Samuel speaks of intermingling linguistic features without any boundaries and control. And some elsewhere they say translanguaging is the deployment of the speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named and usually national and state languages. So my question really is, yes, there might be situations where features or languages or whatever are deployed free of any control, but does that capture the whole reality of bilingual language use? And that's something we will keep in mind as we go. Now, debate about translanguaging can go on and on and on, and I will just to say that we retain two things. So language, rather preferring linguistic features over language, and this notion of free, unbounded deployment of linguistic features. Now, from here, they can then move into my work, or what I'm calling the journey of my work, starting from a context. And Chanel said that I was born in Rwanda. That's true. And on the map, you have Rwanda is this small place here, with the big Tanzania on the east. On the north, we have Uganda. South, we have Burundi. And on the west, we have even gigantic Democratic Republic of Congo. And I'm putting this here because the situation in Rwanda seems to have been influenced by Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo in ways we will see it in what follows. But before we get to there, just a comment about Burundi and Rwanda. So Rwanda and Burundi seem to be a very good example of what one can call named languages as different from language, because Kinyarwanda and Kirundi are really, I don't know, the same language if you want. And there is mutual intelligibility almost 100%. And there is like the VOA, the Voice of America, has a program for speakers of Kinyarwanda and Kirundi, and the same presenters just for both. It doesn't matter whether it's somebody speaking Kirundi or somebody speaking Kinyarwanda, they know, everybody will understand. So likewise, the BBC has a program called the Gahuza Miryango, again, for the same speakers, for Rwanda and Burundi. Again, whether somebody comes from Burundi or comes from Rwanda, speaks Kinyarwanda or speaks Kirundi, does not matter. The program is still accessible to everybody. So we could say the difference between Kinyarwanda and Kirundi is a matter of names, really. These are named languages. So that said, though, we can move on to the journey itself. If we look back into history, the 60s in Africa will have been the period of independence. People were, shaking the shackles of colonization, to use the big word, and obtaining political independence. And Rwanda and Burundi and Congo and Tanzania and the rest got independent that period. The 70s to the 70s, 80s can be characterized as a period of cultural and linguistic awareness. People becoming aware of the originality, their identities as different from the colonizers. In some parts of the world, of course, colonization had been geared towards assimilation, especially from the the French. But yeah, even in in the case of Rwanda and Burundi and Congo, which were under Belgian rule, there was a tendency to want to show themselves as Belgians or something, or denying their identity. So in the 70s, 80s came this movement of becoming aware of who they are. And you had in Congo, you had Mobutu beating the drums of authenticity. You have to be Zairian. In fact, they changed the name of the country too, from Congo to Zaire, because he believed Congo was a legacy from colonization. And he called the country Zaire. And he started beating the drums of, like I'm using the term, of authenticity. You have to be Zairian, you have to wear clothes of a kind, Bakosi, you have to have some music, you have, so rejecting the past. And in some sense, that was also part of building the country, the massive country, as a nation. And on the East, again, in Tanzania, although Tanzania had, in a way, drifted away from Western ways of thinking through, even politically, because they adopted socialism, there was this thinking of education, what Nyerere called education for self-reliance. And there is a reference for that. People can follow that up. Now, some ideas within here were that education, colonial education, was geared towards serving colonial interests. And the system was so selective, extremely selective, because not many people were needed to run the colonial, to serve in the colonial administration. And so he, for example, speaks of 33% of students moving from primary to secondary. And the whole thing was, so primary was, in paper at least, meant to prepare for secondary, secondary to prepare for higher education. And he was saying this is unacceptable. We have to be preparing for serving the community. So the primary education should be geared towards graduates going into the community. Secondary school should be shaped towards graduates going to serve in the community, and so forth and so on. But this had consequences, of course, in terms of, even in terms of the language, in terms of the curriculum and so on. So these two kind of ideas seem to have penetrated into Rwanda. I'm not saying it's anything documented as such, but if you think about it, Rwanda seems to have been influenced by these two poles. And there was this cultural revival in Rwanda, especially after 1975. And the president was heard many times speaking of Igiwachu, what belongs to us. We have to cherish ours, we have to cherish our culture, we have to cherish our food, our views, our ideas, our ways of living. And that, again, included language and behavior, rejection of what was then called Evolué, and so forth. And on the educational grounds, we have the school reform implemented since 1978, which very much seems to have picked up ideas from education for reliance. So, for example, primary school moved from 6 years to 8. The idea being that at 12, when you finished primary school, you couldn't really serve. This idea of, and then on top of that, of course, you had another 3 years of post-primary training. The curriculum seemed to be any sort of general humanities to vocational training. People learn trades. Again, in Rwanda, as in Tanzania indeed, there was the system had been so selective that there are reports that on independence, Rwanda and Burundi together had only a handful of graduates, no more than 100. university graduates, I mean, simply because they were not needed for the purpose of colonial administration. So the system changes in education. The medium of instruction moves from transitional bilingualism, whereby the first 3 years of primary school were in Kinyarwanda, the rest in French. The system therefore became French, and the idea was it was going to be, Kinyarwanda, it was going to be Kinyarwanda throughout. It never happened, but that was the policy. And in all this mix of education, language, identity, and so forth, the use of two languages in the same conversation, or people will speak of code switching, and I prefer the term language alternation, came for a bashing, really. People just started saying that's bad, that should not, it's a problem, especially for that authenticity they were talking about. And you have, I have two linguists, I'm quoting from two linguists here, my former colleagues, in fact, well, colleagues, because they were so much older than me. So you have the first one, for example, Gafaranga, saying that he believes in French as the language of France, which vehicles the French culture in Belgian and Canadian. And Kinyarwanda as the Bantu language, which is a vehicle for the Rwandan culture. And he goes on to say diluted French, however you call it, is abhorrent. And so is diluted Kinyarwanda, that some are already calling Ikinyarwanda, which is characterized by rude mixture of the languages and by inappropriate borrowings. So these sort of views can only be, can only have language separateness, the keeping of the two languages apart as the origin. They can only be reflecting that separation and the need to keep the languages apart. Another colleague, another linguist at the National University of Rwanda, was to write that the language alternation is kind of typical of bilingue incapable d'autonomie in the school monocolor anti-Rwanda, that bilinguals who cannot hold a monolingual speech in Rwanda. And it has therefore been necessary to bring back to order those people who are becoming strangers, if not cultural and linguistic apatride, that is, people without a state, without a patrie. So it again kind of saying that language alternation was an index evidence of cultural uprootedness. If you were a true Rwandan, you spoke Kinyarwanda and you spoke French, the two separately. And in this context, then, I started working. I graduated from the National University in 1983 with a degree in modern languages, but they really called it in English. And on the degree, I had been introduced to linguistics, and I have some notions of social linguistics, but very basic ones. And because of that discourse, I reacted to that discourse of the negative picture of the alternate use of Kinyarwanda and the French. And I published an article in the local press, the local media, which I entitled Kinyafrancais, fils unique et légitime du français du Kinyarwanda, by which I meant that language alternation is a normal, that is legitimate outcome of the contact between French and Kinyarwanda. That I was therefore rejecting the views I've already illustrated, which saw Kinyarwanda and French as separated and as in need of being kept separate. I also spoke of Kenya Francais being this unique, that is, if you have one child, you cherish them and you don't bash them like they were doing Kenya Francais. And by the way, the term Kenya Francais seems to be replicated in other contexts where you have frequent language alternation into Spanglish, Chinglish, and the rest of it. And so that was really the beginning of my journey. And in 86, 87, I came to Lancaster University to do an MA in language studies. And this program was particularly interesting because it didn't have a set curriculum. You selected courses from a pool of course and under guidance that suited your interest. And obviously, I selected courses which had to do with bilingualism and language alternation. And at the end of the program, I wrote a dissertation, which I entitled "Towards an Integrative Model of Societal Bilingualism, Rwandan Speech Continua." Though already the speech continua notion is kind of incompatible with the idea of language being separated. But the integrative aspect really was coming from other scholars I had read on the program, such as Closure and so on. And I was reading back what I was writing then. And on page 4 of the dissertation, it says, this dissertation will reject a monolingual view of bilingualism and adopt a bilingual view. It is argued that code switching is not a deviation from a monolingual norm, but a norm in itself. It is not an alternation between two varieties which have their own appropriate situations of use, but a bilingual variety, the choice of which follows identifiable appropriacy rules. Again, this idea of, I don't agree with the idea that bilingualism consists of two separate languages as such. In fact, in the dissertation, I tried to compare a typical separateness model of bilingualism, which is the diglossia model, and what I was observing in Rwanda. And the diglossia model adopts what Baker has referred to as the bicycle metaphor, where the languages in a bilingual situation don't touch, just like the bicycles of, the wheels of a bicycle in a good functioning order, of course. And I compared it to what I thought was happening in Rwanda. And what is interesting is that I make a three-way choice. There is a choice between French and Kinyarwanda, but there is also a choice between Kinyarwanda and language alternation. So if it's a choice, you cannot see it as a deviation from something else. It is a choice in its own right, and it's not Kinyarwanda versus French. It's Kinyarwanda, it's French Kinyarwanda and alternation, by which then I'm giving it an identity, as it were. On the way back from Lancaster, having completed my MA, I attended a conference in Nice, southern France, where I read a paper based on that dissertation. And the paper was entitled Code Switching et le Vernaculaire Bilingue au Rwanda, by which, again, code switching, I'm calling it a vernacular, that is giving it an identity, not seeing it as an alternation between two separate entities. It is an entity in its own right. At least that's what I was thinking. So between then, when I got back to Rwanda for almost 8 years, I was cut off from any research development for the lack of a decent library, and the internet was not available by then. So I stayed there until 95, when I came back to Lancaster to start my PhD. And already in my first year of PhD, I attended a conference at the University of Surrey. And I read a paper there saying Rwandese identities in French, French identities in Kinyarwanda. Now, that's a teasing kind of title because models of bilingualism, especially those based on identity, will say there is a set of identities associated with one language and a set of identities associated with another language, sort of with a code. And I was saying, no, that's not true. That in Rwanda, that's not true. You can show identities can be associated with any language. In fact, this paper came later on to be published as Decoloniality Language Alternation Studies in 2005, where I said that language does not reflect society and society does, and so on. So again, I'm still rejecting that separateness. A year later, I attended a conference in Vigo, Spain, again with the title, I read a paper with the title Code Switching, Code Mixing, or Kinyarwanda for all practical purposes, whereby again I'm rejecting the notion of code switching or the notion of code mixing because they imply separateness. And I simply say it's Kinyarwanda for all practical purposes, it's one. And again, this will later on sort of come together in a paper I later on called Language Separateness, a normative framework in studies of language alternation, whereby I was saying language separateness, this framework is exactly what makes it difficult to account for bilingual language choice practices. So in a way, this, although it comes before translanguaging, you can feel there is a correlation there. It's again this dissatisfaction with the notion of language. Now, from this point, then I started working out. It's not just rejecting. So what if you reject? What do you do? And in 1996, I wrote for the working papers in linguistics in language and social life at Lancaster University, a paper I called Unmapped Code Switching, a members category. And going through the paper and reading the conclusion, I read this. My starting question was whether there is a base code to every conversation characterized by frequent language alternation, and if so, whether that code must necessarily correspond to what we may call a language. I hope I have answered it. The answer is yes, there is a base code to every conversation, but that base code need not correspond to what one may want to call a language. It may also be bilingual. Now, this obviously is divergent with the views according which language is a code, or there is an equation between language and the code, and these notions of code switching actually mean language switching. And I'm sort of saying, no, we need to separate the two. Later on, I mean, within the same period and within PhD time, I worked with a fellow student, and we wrote a paper where we asked this rhetorical question of whether speakers speak a language. And basically, we were saying speakers don't speak a language. And again, if you refer to what we saw in relation with translanguaging, that's exactly what they are saying. Speakers don't speak a language. And that I was referring to that, having that ideas in my PhD time. So the first step of my journey was there for the distinction between the notion of language and these ideas I was developing came in the end to be traceable into the literature in terms of Campbell, for example, speaks of the notion of language as different from the participants' own code. And the Rovereska Kamo discusses the difference between language and communicative code. And so again, there is a relationship between these ideas and the sort of ideas I'm entertaining in my head myself. And so I started there, like I was saying, working out a solution. We cannot just reject, we need to find some way out. And the solution is actually in my PhD thesis, but I will be referring to the different publications which have developed from there. And in one paper, the language versus medium, the study of bilingual conversation, the paper raises the question of whether the concept of language is a useful one in accounting for language choice acts among bilingual speakers. Observation of the data reveals that the concept of language can account for bilinguals' language choice acts only partially. And I think people should notice this. I'm not rejecting the notion of language outright. I'm saying there are situations where it can apply, but it does not apply everywhere. That's probably different from what translanguaging theorists hold, who reject language outright. I say it can account for some of the data. It applies in some cases. And therefore, because it applies in some cases, I speak of suspending it. In a paper entitled Language Choice as a significant aspect of talk organization, I say, for an adequate account of language alternation, an attitude of indifference towards the notion of language needs to be adopted. The concept of language must be suspended. That attitude of indifference, of course, comes from, I had been reading in ethnomethodology and conversational analysis and so forth. So that notion of attitude of indifference comes from there. And indeed, this notion of suspending comes from there as well. So I say the concept of language has to be suspended. I'm not saying has to be rejected. In another paper, I speak of adopting the attitude of a language blind observer. And by this I mean not importing or refraining from importing the concept of language in the data. So as, okay, if it turns out that is the case, fair enough. But if it doesn't apply, not force it in. And so it's an attitude of indifference I'm advocating. I'm not advocating rejecting language outright. Again, in the same paper on language versus medium, we say that we argue that the notion of medium can help overcome some of the problems the traditional notion of language leads to. We define the medium as the actually oriented to linguistic code, that is the communicative code, in which bilingual conversationalists themselves perceive the talk to be conducted. At the same time, in the paper by Alvarez Cacamo, there is this idea that discourse is multimodal. Of course, again, the notion of multimodality wasn't that developed at that point, but Gumperz had already spoken of different contextualization cues, an idea which can be related to this. And they say language choice is one of the communicative code, on a par with gestures and gaze and so forth. Therefore, the starting point for any account of language alternation ought to be not which language has been switched from, but which communicative code has been switched from. And to mark the specificity of this linguistic code, we use the term medium. As the concept of language and that of code are different, there is no need for the actual medium to be, of a bilingual conversation, to be monolingual. It can also be bilingual. So the code may be monolingual, it can be bilingual, and therefore we don't know which one it is on each occasion. We have to discover it. Hence, there is the reason why we have to suspend the notion of language until it turns out to be useful and relevant. So if the bilingual medium is then defined as, although an external observer may label specific instances of talk as instances of two different languages, speakers themselves do not orient to their talk as consisting of an alternation between two distinct realities. Go on to say, this mode is observed when all participants alternate between their languages, both between tongues and within tongues, without attending to the linguistic origin of the various elements they are using. Clearly here, we are in the domain of later on referred to as translanguaging, because in this mode, in the bilingual medium, there is no orientation to language boundaries, to the difference between I'm using this language and then that language. The languages are being used freely, to use the term that translanguaging theory adopts. But I also make this warning that language alternation itself can be selected as the medium of a particular interaction or episode. Does not mean that when it is, any alternation is normative. It does not mean that speakers can freely, it's interesting, the word freely comes again, or was there already. It does not mean that speakers can freely alternate among all the languages in the repertoire. The medium, even when it is bilingual, need not consist of the totality of the languages in the speaker's repertoire. And again, with this notion of the total repertoire, the full repertoire is to be found in translanguaging, but I'm saying it probably is not the case. It's not the case that people deploy freely the whole repertoire. And all of this, because this then leads me into a typology of language choice practices, whereby you have language alternation as negotiation of the medium, language alternation itself as the medium, language alternation as repairable deviance from the medium, language alternation as functional deviance from the medium. So if we take these, translanguaging would, at least as it is defined, would be just this. It would be an aspect of language choice practices, but not all language practices can be described as translanguaging. And to make this even clearer, I will now move into some examples of each of these, and when I comment on each, I'll be showing why we cannot see this as a free alternation, as languages being deployed freely, or as there not being any boundary between the languages or whatever people are using. The first example is what I've described as medium request. It's a type of medium negotiation. I've called it medium request for a reason I cannot go through here. So in this particular case, it's in a family, the bilingual family in Belgium. You have a visitor A, and you have a child B, and the mother is present, but she's not present. She's not involved in this particular episode, and so she's not mentioned. So the visitor tries to engage a conversation with the child and says, uzikubara, which means, do you know how to count? Obviously, that's in Kinyarwanda. And the child checks whether she has understood and says, je sais compter, do I know how to count? And she uses French. And then in 3, A confirms that understanding, but converges, uses French. And from that point on, in fact, the conversation continues in French. So they've negotiated to use French. Now, for obviously the convergence, the idea of converging applies because A has realized that there is a difference between his choice and the child's choice. So therefore, you cannot say it's free. They are deploying language automation languages freely. There is a constraint. They are negotiating which one to use. And the idea of negotiation applies only if there is a difference. And therefore, we cannot really place this as free deployment of linguistic features or languages, depending on which term you want to use. The second example, in fact, we'll look at the second example and the third, are cases where you can indeed speak of translanguaging or free, where people are using languages, choosing from one, mixing languages freely. Now, again, this one was, it illustrates a conversational structure Lena has described as the joint construction of a turn. And the talk takes place among Rwandans in Belgium. And they're basically saying it's easy to notice a Black person amongst white people. And A starts a turn constructional unit, says one Black person among those white people. It says that in Kinyarwanda. B comes into complete, says Sasoromark. It cannot be missed. And in 3, A ratifies that completion as appropriate by repeating the complementer. So they start in Kinyarwanda, complete in French, and the French is ratified. But if you look at extract number 3, it's the same structure. Again, these Rwandans in Belgium are saying they do the chores themselves, because if they tried, they would have to pay the person who they tried to find somebody to help them. They would have to pay them. And in 1, A starts the turn in Kinyarwanda, B completes the turn in Kinyarwanda, and A ratifies the completion. Now, if you go back to number 1, Lena says that in this structure, the prior component, the first component, projects where completion can take place. It also projects the form of the completion. If we then take language choice, the languageness of an item as part of its form, we have a problem. We will say either the structure projects that if you have Kinyarwanda in the first part, completion is going to be in French, and we have extract 2 accounted for. But that does not account for extract 3. On the other hand, if we say, if you have a situation where a turn projects, the first component projects the second component to be within the same language, we can account for 3, but we cannot account for 2. And the only way we can get out of this is obvious to say the structure does not project the choice of the element to follow, the second element. In other words, language is not oriented to as such. Language choice is not oriented to as such. It's just not an issue. And in this case, then we can say people can use the elements in the repertoire without any orientation to the languageness of those elements. And therefore, this can easily be said to be translanguaging, according to the definition placed. A second example of this is what you have here. You remember I was talking earlier about the promotion of Kinyarwanda. There was a commission which was set up to develop the language, and in fact, have to be open here. I take part in the conversation and the discuss why I took part in the conversations. So A says in that commission they were talking of developing or promoting Kinyarwanda. I want to qualify it. I don't find the right word, and you have all these hesitations of Kinyarwanda, Kitagize, and then B and C come in to help, and that's something you always find in conversations. When there is a problem, everybody gears up to contributing and solving it. And conversation is a joint enterprise. So B and C come in to help in an overlap. And they come in to help using the same language. And then A ratifies the repair as appropriate. Now, there are all kinds of questions you can ask here. How come B and C predict that French was appropriate? Because it is ratified, A ratifies it. Or indeed, were they orienting to French as such? And my argument is this behavior shows that in this case, they are not holding the languages to be separate. They are just saying we can use either one or the other. If you have a problem in one language, finding a word in Kinyarwanda, you can use a word in French. It doesn't matter, and people will recognize it. In which case, again, in this case, we can speak of translanguaging, at least according to the definitions as we saw them earlier. Then we have language alternation as repairable deviance. And extract 5 comes from an interview, a broadcast news interview. And the participants, it's actually a panel interview here. And the participants are talking about the tendency among Rwandans to send their children abroad for all kind of reasons, studying, work, and basically because life is better out there. And the interviewee says something, then it says, in a few words, mentality. And you have then a language formulation which says, that's how I might call it in French. And at that point, the interviewer comes in and says, it's a mentality. And in 3, the interviewee ratifies the repair. So here again, you cannot say there is no orientation to the difference between French and whatever else they are using, as not only because they have formulated it in, this is how I might call it in French, and also because of the repair. So mentality, the French mentality is in a way deleted, and the new term, unknowingly, the Kinyarwanda item, is adopted as revealed in the ratification in 3. So again, in this case, you really cannot say people are deploying the languages freely without any recognition of the boundaries or the difference between the two, or the 3, or however many they are using. A second example of this, again, in the same set of data, you have participants are talking the international jurisdiction of courts, and they are specifically speaking of Spanish courts. And there is a history behind this because after the genocide, a Spanish judge tried to indict Rwandan officials and blah, blah, and so on. So in one, the speaker says there is a third one where they say they are specific, they say, and everything else linked to the interest of Spain. Everything else is, apart Spain, obvious, everything else is Kinyarwanda, except linked. Now, in two, one of the panel members accepts and says, carry on, yes. But in three, the interviewer corrects, repairs the linked, says, give it a hodi. So linked is repaired into Kinyarwanda. And in four, the person, the interviewee, who used the linked in the first place, ratifies the repair. So you have a situation where, therefore, the interviewer is saying English is out of place here. It's got to be repaired. And therefore, you cannot say, it really is not the case that there is no orientation to the difference, to the boundaries between English in this case and whatever else medium or language they are using. There is a clear, it's repaired. And finally, we have examples of being called functional deviance. The first example was again recorded among the Zairian, the Rwandans in Zaire, currently Congo. And it's in 1996. The Rwandan army has crossed into Congo officially to repatriate, to bring back the refugees. The war went on and became what has been known as the First Congo War, toppling President Mobutu. Now, the Rwandans in Belgium are saying, now that the Rwanda army has crossed into Congo, the Zairians are going to start saying, kick out to the Rwandese. This is a case of speech presentation. They are going to start saying, kick out to the Rwandese. Now, the reported speech comes in Swahili, the language used in that part of Zaire where the refugees are based. So in a way, there are two things. There is the content, what they are going to say, but also how they are going to say it. And in the study of speech presentation, I have shown how normally, if there is no motivation for it, the medium of the conversation is maintained. Switch or deviance is for a reason. And in this case, I consider it to be a case of documenting, adding more document to the identity of the speakers as Zairians, because the Swahili is the language they use in that part of Congo. And again, you cannot say here that it's free deployment of the languages because it's motivated. And the last example is of what I call other language recalibration for the purpose of word clarification. And again, it comes from interviews, broadcast interviews. It involves the interviewer and the interviewee, who happens to be the Rwandan Minister of Foreign Affairs. And Rwanda has adopted a position different to most African countries in the African Union on a particular issues, which I cannot go into here. But the interviewer says, this is very clear, especially that there is what has been called new colonialism. He uses ukolonialism, which is a Kinyarwanda translation of neocolonialism. So he uses Kinyarwanda and then puts the French, the French equivalent, what everybody would have access to, because ukolonialism is like, it's a literal translation on the spot. Now, the question here is, if they can freely use the languages in the repertoire, why start with this translation? I mean, with this literal translation. Why didn't they stick in there neocolonialism and go on, which they do in many other cases? Now, the reason is I'm saying there is a difference between there is an orientation to the difference between Kinyarwanda, what we are using now, and French neocolonialism. Otherwise, if there was no difference, they would just put the French item and forget about the Kinyarwanda item. And therefore, there is a reason to believe in this case, there is an orientation to the boundaries between the languages, or at least between the medium and whatever else, between French and whatever else. And so to summarize then, I started with early struggle with the notion of language and the resulting construct of language separateness. I was very unhappy with it. I ended up redefining the problem as that of the incompleteness of accounts which are based on language separateness. And this led me into proposing to suspend the notion of language, not to reject it, but to suspend it. And at the end of the day, the account I end up with turns out to be to provide a broader picture of bilingual language practices than the picture proposed by translanguaging, because translanguaging theory would just account for one aspect. In fact, from this, you might as well say, if that is the case, it too has to be suspended, just like the notion of language. But I'm not going to go into that. Now, there is a next step in my work, is then if I've proposed how to approach language alternation, language trace practices among bilingual speakers, what next? And that's the next step of my work, based on this notion of interactional practices, bilingualism seen as interactional practices. If there are any questions on this, I'm happy to give further clarification. And on this then, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joseph, for your presentation. I'll now pass the floor to Dr. Makoni for a discussion, and thereafter I will open the floor to the wider audience. Professor Makoni.
Thank you very much, Joseph and Mfundo. I have three questions that fall into three categories.
Yes.
The first one is a futuristic question. So there might not be any coherent answer to it at the moment. This is my reading of the history of ideas. Mm-hmm. Ideas will come and go. Another generation will struggle with different notions. My question to you is this: what does a post-translanguaging sociolinguistics look like? Well, in as much as translanguaging has dominated our imaginary for the time being, it will come and go. That's just in the nature of scholarship. So I'm asking you to play the role of academic prophet. Yes. And just project freely what you think would be the intellectually sedimented ideas that generation of people in the future will be struggling with.
Yeah, so post-translanguaging, yeah.
In a post-translanguaging era.
Yeah. Can I react to this? Or right, maybe that ties in with what I said at the end of the presentation. Where to from here? Mm-hmm. Now, I think it's in ethnomethodology, I think they say research
Mhm.
is communication,
Mhm.
and communication has to be interesting and relevant. And if you elaborate a concept,
Mhm.
you cannot go on it forever.
Yes.
There has to be a post to it, and
There has to be a
obviously
pursuit. Yes.
knowledge is never static.
Mm.
Now, a starting point, of course, in all this is people will take translanguaging and start looking at it, scrutinize it. What's in it? What does it fail to do? Just like
Mhm. Yeah.
I've been doing. What does it fail to do? Do we
Yeah.
need to keep it if it's clearly not doing the job? If it's looking at some, but not all. And
Yeah.
I guess in my line of research,
Mm.
I think I've touched on it.
Mhm.
It will have to be suspended just like languages.
Mhm.
Now, that's obviously my line of research, but
Yes.
people coming from other backgrounds will know how to deal with it. I guess I cannot speak, for example, on the side of somebody coming from a psycholinguistic perspective, because they will have to look at translanguaging from their
Perspective.
their perspective, and eventually they will find problems with it. But for me, it's already a problem. It deals with only some aspects of language practices among bilinguals, and not all of them. So I don't even want to adopt it right here. So yeah, I guess it will. An answer to that will be different ways of thinking about language practices. Will engage the concept and develop from there. New concepts will appear.
Yeah.
There's going to be new concepts which will try to overcome the limitations of translanguaging. But the first step is definitely to engage it, to see what it tells us, what it gives us, why keep it, why? Because at the end of the day, like I said, it came in a particular context of people being unhappy with the notion of language. People will be unhappy with the notion of translanguaging, and something else will follow, and I cannot predict at this point really what it is going to be. Like I said, in my case, I've already said I cannot adopt it because it's limited. It does not help me. It does not serve does not answer my kind of question.
It doesn't. Yeah. Okay. Let me continue with this with the questions. I have two more, then I'll hand over. You are willing to suspend the notion of language,
yes,
but not to reject it.
Yes.
Okay, just hold on to that. What is it that you intellectually lose if you rejected the notion of language? Okay, don't respond and say, I won't reject it. Just assume theoretically in this scenario that you had rejected it. And in that world that you and me are creating, that fictitious world that we're creating, in which we've suspended, not suspended, we've rejected language. What is it that we can't do in a world in which language has been suspended, which we can do in a world in which language is central? In other words, the way I hear you is like this. I suspend language, but the notion of language creates too many problems. And I'm saying, just for the sake of fiction, reject it completely. And then ask, when I reject it, what do I lose and what do I win? Then I will respond to that discussion.
Okay.
This is just fiction, so don't worry about it.
Yeah. Yes. What do I lose if I reject it?
Yeah. What do you lose? What if you reject it? Other than that, you are like me. If I reject it, they will say, but you're a professor in applied linguistics. How can you reject language? Okay, that's a different.
That's a different question. Okay. The reason okay, I very much want to reject it, but again, like I said, it's communication. Like I said, I'm adopting the notion of code.
Yes.
Rather than language. So if I can communicate
Yes.
my research using the term code, and everybody would understand, I'm happy to say people don't speak a language. That really was the beginning. But communicating to people who are used to language as code,
yes,
the risk is you create a confusion again. They will read your use of code as meaning language, when in fact you've already put that aside. So it is that communication issue of how do you communicate your
thoughts to those.
Thoughts to those.
Okay.
Because before everybody gets into your thinking mode, it's difficult to find the words to use, and it's in that sense I'm happy to keep the notion of language, because there are situations where it applies.
Yeah,
it does not create problems, but there are situations where it does create problems, and that's why I say, yeah, a better term would be code, but can I communicate with it?
Yeah, this then will be the last to comment. If you were to ask me to think these ideas carefully, I would say that at least in certain Southern African contexts, I know best, or I should know best, the individuals communicate not through language, but through human speak. It gives you a different typological characterization of language.
Yeah.
But the important aspect of notions about human speak is that it enables, at least for me, it enables me language in the following way. That language is whatever anybody construes it to be from a layperson's perspective. So if X calls this language and Y calls that language and they are different, for me, that's fine. Because then I'm able to, at least that's the sort of Arisian aspect in me, the integrationist in me, that language is whatever any layperson defines as language. Because if I follow that route, I'm able to move away from feeling that there is something called a universal ontology, called that language is a universal ontology, that I reject. And I can, the only positive thing I can then say is, oh, language is whatever you regard it as. So there are no predetermined features, whether they are repertoires or what, which are there, because it depends who that person is. But that's just my own view. Let me give that. Basically, then what that is doing for me at the moment is to say, translanguaging, yes, the translanguaging is interested in aspects about fluidity, etc., etc. But they foreclosed the discussions about what fluidity is, because metaphors about language are grounded on land. So in the book that we are currently working on, that is a pinnacle, we called Pottery Language. The issue is to say, the metaphors that we have to talk about language are inadequate. So for us, it's no longer a question of suspending these metaphors. It's just a question of rejecting them and moving on. But anyway, that's Joseph. That's just when rambling on. Let me hand over to Mfundo. There must be other people hearing things to talk about. You can suspend all my thoughts and listen to other views.
Yeah. I'll now open the floor to everyone else. So if you have a question, you can post on the chat box or you can raise your hand.
Yeah, there's other space.
Yes. Professor Arthur Spears, do you have a question?
Okay. Thank you for your talk. It raised a lot of fundamental questions, and I'm sure it has many of our heads spinning. Trying to sort out these really complex issues, but that's what we're here for, is to work these things out. One of the things I noticed during your remarks is that there is not terminological confusion, but terminological mismatch. There are several groups of linguists who are dealing with these problems. You have those who are interested in bilingualism, multilingualism. You also have the language contact specialists, and among them, those who specialize in pidgins and creoles. And it's understood among those who study pidgins and creoles, but not among those outside, is that when we talk about pidgin and creole languages, we're actually talking about jargons also. Jargons are seen from a grammatical standpoint. They are speech forms, and here's one of the terms that has not been in our conversation today: speech forms. And it's important to consider that term, not that you have to use it, because it refers to a type of speaking, a type of speech. Okay. We need the term speech form because in considering grammar, some languages' structure, in other words, the rules for the organization of what comes out of your mouth, the structure has not been crystallized. And when we say crystallized, we're talking about relatively set, so that everyone is following basically the same rules for structuring what comes out of your mouth. Whether what comes out of your mouth, your speech in other words, has sources in one language, two languages, three languages, and so on and so forth, to use that term, language. There's also the question of types of bilingual communities. We often talk about social bilingualism and individual bilingualism, but social bilingualism breaks down into different types of communities. For example, consider the English-speaking US-based Americans living in a South American Spanish-speaking country, okay? In that community of Americans living abroad, everyone speaks Spanish and they also speak English, okay? So what governs the rules of alternation, so to speak, in that particular community? And at that point, we have to talk about what is the ideology of language governing the speech that comes out of their mouth. When do they use Spanish when they consider themselves speaking English? And when do they use English when they consider themselves speaking Spanish? And that brings in the notion of matrix language, which you mentioned briefly. Is that notion important? It seems to be, based on the considerable research that's done on matrix in the matrix language format, that it's a key concept for talking about alternation in detail, or what some people call switching. So I put those on the table, and my question that is the envelope for all the things that I've pointed out is, how do you feel about that? These terms that are floating around but have not really been anchored. For example, code versus language. There are different definitions of code and language depending on who you're talking to, depending on the subfield of linguistics. So how do you shed light on this problem of terminology, looking at the grammatical side of things as opposed to the nature of the community side, also the languageology, ideology governing talk, and so on and so forth?
Okay. Those are very interesting issues, which I think I probably cannot do justice to here. But I'll try and comment on some of them. So there's the question of terminologies regarding bilingualism, multilingualism, plurilingualism, and all that. There are so many of them, in fact, in the field. Bilingualism and multilingualism being the main ones. Some people making a distinction between bilingualism and multilingualism, bilingualism of the individual, multilingualism of society. The European framework of languages even speaks of plurilanguage. But I guess the way I'm using it, I grew up using the term bilingualism as a generic one, even though I say I have my cherries in the multilingualism. I really use the term bilingualism as a generic one. I never meant to be specific as to whether it's individual, whether it's two or more. It's a generic one. It's the availability. In my courses, I define it as the availability of more than one language in a community. So it's very much community. And that takes us probably into your third comment on communities. Yes, there is a difference between societal bilingualism and individual bilingualism. I kind of think there is even interactional bilingualism. So if you take individual bilingualism to be having to do with the individual, and that tends to take a psycho-linguistic approach, looking at how the languages or language varieties or language features, again, are organized in the mind, as to how societies are organized in terms of the languages, as to how actual conversation, actual interactions are organized. Those are all different levels of bilingualism study. And obviously myself, and again, when I was introduced as being interested in bilingual interactions. So yes, there is the community dimension because conversations and interaction take place in context. But I come from a tradition where, again, following our, who says bilingualism is not in the mind. Bilingualism is a displayed feature of everyday interaction. that really where I come from, and we're talking about interactional practices. And so let's say then if a community of Spanish speakers in the United States use the languages they have in a particular way, it does not necessarily mean it's going to be the same as a community of Rwanda speakers in Belgium use their own language. But that's an empirical question. Maybe the challenge is, so if, and that goes back to what Sinfre was saying, if something is proposed, this is the way I see bilingualism or bilingual interactions working, and somebody is absolutely free to find that in their community and it works differently, and that's fine. That's not a problem. And that's how we can grow as a discipline. Somebody investigating communities of Spanish speaking in the United States, finding it different from the way we people or Rwandans in Belgium speak. That's not a problem. And in that conversation we can develop. Otherwise, we are static if we just reproduce what somebody else has said. That conflict, that clash of ideas is where how knowledge is built. Again, you also mentioned the notion of matrix language. A term, I guess, comes from Myers-Gotten.
Mhm.
And that links to the other point about grammar. Again, that's true that, I mean, it's a fact that if you look at bilingualism in grammatical terms, you are going to need these notions of matrix language. Find it appropriate or not appropriate, but that's not really what I do. I look at bilingual interaction from a conversation analytic perspective, and I actually don't do anything about grammatical analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because I don't believe conversations are organized grammatically. We take conversations, we abstract them of context, we conceive of a language structure, which we can then analyze as grammar. I come from a different perspective. We look at conversations as they are and analyze them as they are without editing them, without polishing them. Hence, these notions of metrics and grammatical orderliness is not really of paramount importance when you look at conversations from the way I do from a conversation analytic perspective. By the way, shall I also mention here that in my book on talking two languages, I make the point that grammatical studies and interactional studies have something in common, which is to account for orderliness. How is it that discourse is orderly? You can find order in grammar, but you can find order somewhere else. But I don't do grammar as such. I don't study the grammar of language attenuation or what is known as the grammar of code switching. Again, the last point you mentioned was language and the code, and I think I've touched on that very briefly. There seems to have been a confusion for a long time between language and code. Mm-hmm. So language as code, hence code switching, basically being the same as language switching. And my work is precisely to reject that. I take language and code to be different. Mm-hmm. And code switching, the switching of communicative codes. And you will have noticed that I speak of language alternation. So can alternate languages, that does not make it code switching. Simply because I see code and languages as two different things. I don't know if I've addressed some of your concerns, but because they are very good ones. The literature is replete with these terminological issues, and I wish somebody clarified them once for all, but I don't think it will ever happen.
And you'll notice that I was using alternation, the term that you prefer, and I was trying to avoid code because it's so closely associated with code switching and all of that research, which is inadequate in view of your research. But thank you very much. You've really raised some fundamental questions, and you've certainly troubled my thinking. And I'll have to rethink a lot of things. But you are the instigator.
All right, thank you. If I can do that, that's very good.
Tassis made 2 comments on the chat box. So the first comment reads as follows. She mentions that communication or teaching language in primary schools reformed in Rwanda, also changed from French to Kinyarwanda. And she also states that all schools' curricula were to be rendered in Kinyarwanda, with many Francophone-oriented minds disputed the idea whether disciplines or content subjects such as mathematics could be taught successfully in Kinyarwanda. And then the next question comes from Dorothy. And her question reads as follows. She first thanks you for a fascinating talk. And then she asks if whether translanguaging is similar to or is the same thing as polyphony. What is the instrumentality of translanguaging or polyphony in knowledge production and communication?
Okay. Yeah, Tarsis is, I guess it's the Tarsis I know who is Rwandan. Yeah, so in the school reform, there was the language side, and yeah, I said it was hoped that everything would be taught in Rwanda, all the way from primary to university. Just like it was the case in Tanzania, they hoped they would do everything in Swahili, but in both cases, I don't think they have ever done it. In any case, the school reform, the Rwandan school reform, was abandoned in the early 90s, even before it was implemented. I mean, there was some attempts to implement it at the secondary level, but definitely at the primary level, like I said, they moved from transitional bilingualism, where you had Kinyarwanda as a medium for the first 3 years, then French for the rest of the schooling career. So they moved, and the Kinyarwanda was actually used as the medium for primary school for that period of 78 to 91 too, before they abandoned it. And another thing too, I should have mentioned in that period, there was a lot of work on Kinyarwanda, which was very good. At the university, they opened a department of Kinyarwanda and African languages, mostly Swahili. There was a lot of work on Kinyarwanda, which is still relevant today. So not everything was lost, but it hasn't been carried and followed up. Now, the polyphony, I don't know, I really don't know how to react to this because I don't know what is meant by it. Maybe
Dorothy, would you like to elucidate on that? On what polyphony is? Or what you mean by polyphony?
I think she just left for another meeting.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks, Anna. And then the next question comes from Deboho. So he first thanks you for presenting the language politics of translanguaging in Francophone Rwanda. And he mentions that this gives us a glimpse of the language practices in Francophone Africa. So his impression from, so he says, his impression from outside Francophone areas in the Francophone Africa is more attached to French more than Anglophone Africa, even outside the fact that there is a bigger area in Africa that is Francophone. His question is and his question reads as follows: with a view of liberation from European languages, if it is possible, from your point of view, what opportunity is there to develop or other languages that are African and could be developed to replace French? For example, Kiswahili that could be used in East, Central, and Southern Africa.
Right. Languages are not just structures; they are also political phenomena. They are politics, and you may wish to replace French or English in that matter with a local language like Kiswahili. That shouldn't be a problem. The problem is at the political level. Like we've seen, Rwanda has tried, and Tanzania has tried, but these efforts have not gone as far as they were anticipated to go. And there are kinds of political games that go on. If you drop English or if you drop French, you are in a way touching on the interests of France and of the UK or America, and maybe the chances of success will require some sort of political and economic and social independence, which is not there yet. Which does not mean that people can try and free their minds, but they also have to be aware that it's not just dropping one language to another. There are some there are some experiments, but those have failed. Another experiment, which probably could be revealing, but it does not address the question, it's just by comparison. Rwanda decided in 2010, they introduced English as the medium. It seems to have worked. But maybe that's because of the power that English came with. English can replace French. But would it be possible to replace English or French with a local language? I don't know. So there has to be that political dimension, power dimension to deal with. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think it would be a free ride.
Yeah. And then we have the next question from Sangita.
Thank you, Joseph. This was very interesting, and it took me back 10 years. I had a doctoral student who was very inspired by your work, and we did some fun things together. And so this was really very interesting to see where you are now. Okay, so I have a CA education in my own doctoral work, which was I did anthropological field work in the late 80s and early 90s. And at that point, so I'm going back to the history. You did a very good presentation showing how the field and how your own work actually foreruns the work of Nancy Hornberger and others who take up continuum, the concept of continuum. So I found that very interesting with your master's thesis. So looking at the history of CA, we know that there was a very concerted decision made in the 1970s to generate so-called naturalistic data by audio recordings. And we can understand that because we did not have sophisticated, handable, practical recording work. And so the continuing oral language bias, which is presented in written work today, I think also needs to be accounted for. You mentioned very briefly the multimodality. issue. And what happened, I never ended up using CA in my doctoral work. I finished my thesis in 1995 for the simple reason that the data that I generated was people were speaking and writing in 5, 6, 7 named languages. So CA fell short of what I needed to do. But today, when we continue to use primarily oral language to make claims for the complexities and the richness, so we strip the richness of human communication. And in one of your excerpts, you mentioned that the mother was there, but she was not participating in the oral languaging that was taking place. I mean, that is just the point, that someone being there in an interactional space will shape, will color how we create meaning. So that's where I'm coming from. And meaning, communication meaning for participants hinges on multimodal inter-illumination. And this particular doctoral student of mine, ex-doctoral student, Oliver St. John, and I, we did a very simple experiment that we then published, and I'll be happy to share this with you. This was 8-9 years ago. We took turns, 8 or 9 turns from a classroom interactional space, and we present a CA analysis of it. And then we go on to add pictures to highlight how what the teacher and what the pupils in a French classroom in Sweden, what they were doing does not make sense from this CA analysis. We had video recordings from this classroom. And then we do a third step where we bring in the teachers and the pupils' physical arenas, the teachers' hand orientations, and we show that layer completely puts into dispute what CA was doing. And the reason we could do this was I'm invested, but not Oliver, I'm invested in the field of deaf education, where you cannot use CA for the simple reason that you have to account for multimodality in a very different way. So in that particular field in the 90s, concepts like chaining, so trying to say how Swedish Sign Language, written Swedish, embodiment, gaze are needed because they inter-illuminate and they present ideas and vocabularies that we don't have in mainstream language studies. So bringing this kind of different kinds of trajectories of heritage together then problematizes neodualisms like translanguaging, plurilingualism, and the continuing entrenchment of older concepts like bilingualism and multilingualism. So I wonder whether you would think with me and comment on the need for CA to kind of leave its hold on the oral language data and attend to how human beings in these digitalized times make meaning. And here we've been toying with the concept of normal languaging to get away from translanguaging, because that has been claimed to be what is the English word? It's branding in principle. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, again, quite a few things there. The language bias, the written language bias is obviously clear, and it's been clear along. And nobody, even though in the CA you have transcripts, they always say the data, the actual data are the recordings. Now, initially, obviously, when CA was developing, they only had access to audio recordings. But later on, video recordings and these days technologies are developing exponentially. And the discipline might be behind the technology, but already they speak of multimodal conversational analysis. It exists. People have been looking at conversation analysis, doing conversation analysis involving all the modalities to see how communication works and indeed how those other modalities work together for effective communication. So that does exist, and it is especially, I was reviewing a paper on deaf communication and language alternation. It's fascinating again to see how non-verbal modes can communicate more than language. Now, as much as multimodal conversation analysis is interesting and fascinating, it raises another question. It is another question of how much can you do? Can you specialize in all kinds of modalities? Or are we going in the end to say, okay, communication we accept is multimodal, but for the purpose of analysis, I'm interested in this? Or are we going to say, I'm analyzing this extract to understand it fully? So that takes us back to the distinction between a study of collection and the study of a single instance. If you look at one instance, you can then look at all the modalities, or the modes and the codes which are used to make it happen. But if you are looking at a collection of conversations and trying to trace a pattern, it's not likely that you will take into account all the modalities all the time for everything, and that becomes a matter of choosing. I'm focusing on language choice as a mode, but I'm not excluding the possibility that it interacts with other modes, and that's the very idea of contextualization cues, according to Lampert. It's actual communication brings in all, works at different levels, and different levels interact and make communication. But for the purpose of analysis, I think at the end of the day, there is always going to be a process of selection, unless we just look at single instances and want to understand them in full. So, but the possibility of doing multimodal conversation analysis exists already, and people have been doing it. I don't do it, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but my point was not that. My point was that it is this oral language bias that then is written down. I'm aware of the multimodal, the addition of pictures and all, but I'm not sure if I understood the previous questions that were put by Arthur and Sinfree, but I think the point is that languages or communication is so much more complex that using, and here I see CA as something that is straitjacketed. When you study its history, there is a reason why we only have done oral recordings. And it then, instead of having the recordings, when we go for conferences or when we write papers, it becomes the kind of extracts that you present. And this richness gets stripped off. So how do we then account for what are our own metaphors for understanding this richness? So that is where I was coming from, to say, how can does CA need to make a radical turn rather than just maintain its turns and repairs and the vocabulary that it has? How can we use, all transcripts have to be reductionistic. So I'm not trying to make a claim that we are able to somehow create 8,000 words, some articles where we bring in everything. That is not the aim of science, but I think that there is this concern with the orality that continues to be what becomes equated as language. So in deaf studies, we continue to hear people say the language used, and then actually what they mean is oral language used, not even written language. And so we can forget signed languaging. So there is that. I was trying to get at that understanding, not with the multimodal turn that Jewett and others have contributed to. But what my concern is that in this area of language science is we seem to have so many parallel streams that are not talking to one another. So deaf studies is not talking to multilingual scholarship, multilingual scholarship is not talking to, so that is a concern, and that might allow us to understand why these metaphors continue to live and why we see neodualisms erupt.
Yeah. No, you. I think you're absolutely right. There's a concern, I think, of what do we do? Do we study language or do we study communication?
But I like what you are offering when you say we should be studying social practices or human meaning making.
Yeah.
And then we cannot hold on to our straight-jacketed theories and methodologies. And for me, CA has become a methodology that has lost its power to say meaningful things about the complexities that human communication constitute. So you have actually given us the answer, I would argue.
Okay, then. Yeah. Conversationalists will say they have a focus and interest, and I don't think they would lightly take the criticism of them being straight-jacketed. They will say it's it's a question of rigor and methodology. So, and that criticism has been around for quite some time indeed. Debates go on whether you stick onto the transcripts and the recordings, or whether you bring in other things that go on in communication. And at the end of the day, what is it that you are interested in? Because they say we are interested in talk organization.
Yeah.
That being the
So I see that we have like a couple of questions on the chat box. However, we've run out of time. So I'll now hand over to Professor Makoni, who will make his final remarks. Thereafter, Vishna will announce our next speaker, and then we will head straight to our after party. So if you have questions, you can reserve them for now, and then you can ask them during our after party. Yes, Professor Makoni, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joseph. I think the key argument that you are making is that languages should not be seen as hermetically sealed units. Right? I think that we are in agreement. But the other interesting debate that you had begun which you touched on towards the end, is are we studying language or are we studying communication? Each analyst will have to make up their own distinction about the two. For me, the two are different. What we are experiencing now is communication, which includes language. And language is the analytical apparatus that you use to talk about communication. So language, to some extent, from that perspective, will always be reductionist, because it can never capture the entire parameter and panoply of what constitutes communication. it is that distinction between language and communication that enables me to say, oh, in some communities, they don't have language. I don't mean they don't talk to each other. That would be absurd. I mean that there may not be studies in how people are analyzing. There may not be linguistic studies about communication. So I need to maintain a rhetorically dramatic distinction between communication and language in order to move forward. So basically, what I'm saying for myself, not for anybody else, is that I have to frame the terms in a manner that makes sense to me in order to move forward. For some people, they may not want the distinction between language and communication. God help them all. I want it because it enables me to say the linguistic analysis is inadequate because it gets preoccupied with written discourses. Even when it is dealing with oral transcriptions, they finally get it into a written text, because there's no linguistics that deals with an analysis of recordings. It needs to be converted into written text. So linguistics is about writing. Once I've done that, I'm able to move on into other areas. So I then don't get worried too much about whether it's oral or not, because I know as a discipline, linguistics has been framed as a written text. Even if it's oral, it's transcribed, and then it has to be written down. I even come across a linguist who analyzes an oral text without writing it down. So methodologically, we are tied to the written word. So basically, the linguistics that I'm talking about is a linguistics called a linguistics of writing. Once I have adopted that position, then I move on into other areas. But that is me rambling on. Let's move on to more interesting people. Now we get Vishna. Can you let us know